Welcome to the Automation World Get Your Questions Answered podcast, where we connect with industry experts to get the answers you need about industrial automation technologies. And find even more answers by subscribing to Automation World magazine at subscribeaw.com. That's subscribeaw.com. I'm David Greenfield, Director of Content for Automation World, and the question we'll be answering in this episode is how to use remote I/O in the main electrical enclosure. So joining me today to answer this question is Brian Little of Avancion, an industrial automation system integrator. So thanks for joining me today, Brian.
Thanks for having me.
So given that an I/O module is an input-output device that processes inputs from a field device such as a sensor or actuator to send to a controller and then sends output commands back from the controller to the device, let's start by explaining the differences among remote I/O, distributed I/O, and local I/O.
Yeah, absolutely. Local I/O usually assumes that the I/O modules are in the same rack or chassis as the controller, right? So they're right next to it, doing their job. Distributed I/O, can be in a separate or a different location than the main controller, but distributed I/O usually has some kind of computing power at that remote location. So it's doing its own processing of information and maybe turning on and off the outputs regardless of the main processor. And then basic remote I/O is, again, that remote location, but it doesn't have any local computing power.
Okay, thanks for clarifying the differences among those three. So, with the definition of remote I/O essentially indicating that the I/O modules aren't located in the main electrical enclosure, let's get to the reader question behind this podcast question, which is how do you use remote I/O in the main electrical enclosure? And what would be the benefit of doing this? I mean, it seems like doing that goes against the whole point of remote I/O.
Yeah, I would say that statement probably applied, a few years ago or whatever. But there's actually a lot of good benefits of doing it now. Three of them being number one, safety. Number two, you can save a lot of wiring inside of larger enclosures, and also standardization. I'll go back to the safety. Obviously, there's big pushes now for arc flash inside of panels. So what you can do is, separate different doors inside your panel where you might have your high voltage side and your low voltage side, and you can put remote I/O in that high voltage side, and then that can assist with troubleshooting without having to open those doors. The other one is there's a lot of safety controllers now that use remote I/O. So again, if you need to put some kind of safety into a door in that higher voltage side, you can. And from a standardization, if you use all remote I/O, a plant or a company can standardize on their spare parts. They can, you know, trim down their training on the same parts, and then also drawing standards just by using the same part in different locations.
Thanks for explaining that, Brian. And we'll be back with more insights into remote I/O use after this brief announcement from Automation World. Would you like to be part of this podcast series that reaches thousands of listeners across industry? Because the questions that form the topics of these podcasts come from our audience, we'd love to feature our audience members as guests. So if you're interested, contact me via email at dgreenfield@automationworld.com to learn more. And now, let's get back to the podcast. So, Brian, I understand that the upfront cost for remote I/O can be more expensive than local I/O. Is that understanding still correct? And if so, what are the key advantages to remote I/O that make this higher initial cost worth it?
Yeah, I actually don't feel that to be true anymore as far as the cost. You really can get the same performance from a more compact I/O module anymore that may be less expensive than main PLC I/O cards.
Hmm.
I think really the upfront costs maybe come down to the network infrastructure you might need to do remote I/O. But again, the industry is all trending towards everything being on some kind of network. So that infrastructure is probably already in place, right? So if you already have Ethernet for your PLC and your HMI, throwing on an Ethernet remote I/O isn't much of an addition. And really, I would go back to the as far as the key advantages, I would go back to that safety factor. But I would also add future expansion, as a good benefit of doing the upfront design that way. A main PLC chassis usually only has a maximum number of slots, but you can always add remote I/O. So having that in place adds for expansion in the future.
So I guess, using remote IO in the main electrical cabinet wouldn't impact these benefits that you're mentioning in any way, or is there potentially some impact with that?
I don't think it impacts it at all. Actually, I think it sets you up for the future. Actually,
Okay. All right. So it seems like the way to go. So whether it's local or remote IO, we've essentially been discussing wired IO modules here. But what about wireless remote IO? As with anything wireless and industrial control, there seems to be as many detractors as supporters. So, what's your opinion of wireless remote IO, and would there be any point in using it if you were installing the remote IO in the main electrical cabinet?
I think that really depends on your application. It is independent of what other remote I/O you already have. There's a lot of things going on with data collection now. So if you already had a panel in place and you needed to do some data collection, whether it be vibration or temperature inside your panel, you can easily add some wireless remote I/O to collect that data, and you wouldn't have to build a whole new infrastructure.
So, Brian, this has been a pretty straightforward topic for this podcast that we've covered. So, given that, do you have any further advice as a system integrator for manufacturers who are, making choices about the types of I/O they use as part of their networking strategy?
Yeah, I would say it really comes down to the standardization and the safety that I mentioned earlier. Maintaining the same spare parts for our customers and is a very important thing we try to lean towards. But I would also say, um, setting yourself up to have remote I/O is actually a very good choice. Like I said, it's future expansion and the ease of use.
Okay. Well, thank you for joining me for this podcast, Brian. And thanks, of course, to all of our listeners. And please keep watching this space for more installments of Automation World Get Your Questions Answered. And remember that you can find us online at automationworld.com and subscribe to our print magazine at subscribeaw.com to stay on top of the latest industrial automation technology insights, trends, and news.